Welcome back to the podcast Unbinding the Bible. This is episode 162, Divorce and Remarriage. And on the podcast this week, I want to talk about Jesus' words from Matthew 5, verses 31 to 32. We are still in the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus is working his way through what kingdom righteousness looks like. And so what I want to do in this episode is not just talk in general about divorce and remarriage, but look at it in the context of Jesus's sermon. And of course, we'll need to look at it in the context of his other teaching in Matthew on divorce, as well as what the Old Testament context was like, and even Jesus's immediate context was like. And so what I want to do on this episode is something that's really challenging to do, and that is to realize the weightiness that many people carry in this world and the difficulty that marriage actually presents in this world, but realizing that Jesus is offering teaching which is meant to free us and liberate us, not to create new forms of bondage. And so this is a really, I think, somewhat tricky thing to talk about and to discuss, but I hope that I will make it somewhat clearer if it's at all fuzzy in your own mind, and that it would be an encouragement and a proper explanation of what righteousness in the kingdom looks like according to Jesus. And so that's my plan, that's my hope. As we work our way through it, I hope that we can arrive at that conclusion. So let's just jump right into it and see where we get. To begin this week's episode, allow me just to read Matthew 5, 31 to 32. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, this passage is really short and just kind of punchy, which is why I shared in the introduction that we'll look at Jesus's additional teaching in Matthew chapter 19, which shows up later, obviously, in Matthew's gospel, but we'll need to look at that to try to get a little bit more of the context. But in our context here in the Sermon on the Mount, I want to point out, because I don't think it's coincidental, but I want to point out that this passage immediately follows Jesus' teaching on anger and then lust. And I think if you and I were to take a giant step back, we were to think about anger, we were to think about lust, and the episode that I gave a couple weeks ago on lust, where I really think the focus needs to be on men, which is where Jesus puts it. And sadly, in many of the Christian environments that I've grown up in and then I'm still somewhat a part of, this teaching is still circulating that a lot of the focus goes on to the women. And I don't think that that's accurate. In fact, I would say in general, anger is a problem that is boiling below the surface in a lot of men's lives. It happens in women's lives too, but anger has become one of those emotions that's somewhat acceptable for men, or it's, well, he's just an angry type of a person. And yet anger and lust go hand in hand, I think, and really get twisted up and contorted in men's hearts, which again is what Jesus is talking about. And so he lands on this teaching about divorce. And if we were to pick up the same theme that we looked at last time with lust, we recognize that Jesus once again is speaking about kingdom righteousness, and he's addressing these commands to men. Now, don't get sideswiped or thinking that he doesn't also apply this to women, but I do think it's important to recognize that Jesus has a context. Jesus has a world that he's addressing with the teaching that he's giving. I mean, he will give teaching later about, thinking that the gold is sacred, but the altar that the gold, it is made out of isn't sacred. And he's getting into these dynamics that people take oaths, and what does that mean? And his culture and context were different than ours. So it's important when we think about divorce and we think about remarriage that we don't just catapult his words directly into 21st century American life and assume that what Jesus says is law for us. And what I mean by that is the law itself are the words that God gives to guide his people. And it's important to realize that God, in his mercy and in his grace, works with human beings where they are at a particular time and at a particular place to shift them toward a more holistic way of living. But God does not step into a culture and obliterate everything about that culture that's wrong and bad in order to just present a perfect ideal for his people. Rather, he meets them where they are and says, in this broken system, I'm going to offer you a little bit of a different way of approaching this so that healthier relationships can develop in the middle of this brokenness. And one example of this is in the law of God, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. There are, commands and issues about polygamy. Not because God thinks polygamy is good, but because in a polygamous culture, which is what his people were dealing with right after they came out of Egypt, he's realizing that abuses happen and misfortunes happen to women and broken relationships take place and dysfunctional family dynamics. And so he gives guidance and rules for how to maintain this polygamous culture, if you will, but to do it in a way that treats people with respect and dignity. So this doesn't mean that the law is what God is telling you have to do. Rather, the law is guiding you into how to shift this broken world into something better. And the way we know that's the case is because Jesus here in Matthew 5 is talking about, it was said, it was said, it was said, it was said, but I say to you. So Jesus isn't correcting that entirely. But what he's doing is saying there's a heart motive underlying this that's really, really important. And so the passage that Jesus is referring to here in Matthew 5 is, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. He's actually quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 24, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. But what I want to make sure we realize is in this context that we don't fall into the same trap that Israel's leaders fall into, and that is that if we just apply what Jesus says to our lives, Jesus is saying no divorce, then that, we'll be living righteously, right? But that's not always true, because he's not just giving us instructions on divorce, like disconnected from everything else. He's laying the foundation of what life in the kingdom is really all about. And so in order for us to understand that context, we're going to first look at Matthew 19, which I think gives a little fuller picture of his teaching in Matthew 5 because he repeats some of the same exact words. It'll also give us a little bit of context for what he might be talking about. And then in that passage, the Pharisees and Jesus both allude to Deuteronomy 24. We're also going to look at Exodus 21, which is another Old Testament passage that does deal with marriage, and it deals with it in the context of polygamy, which I know sounds weird, but I have a reason for taking us there, so hang with me. And then Jesus, of course, quotes Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 in his response to the Pharisees in Matthew 19. So we'll talk about that because Jesus does in the passage. And then we'll come all the way back around to Matthew 5, and I hope we can make a little bit of sense of this. So this is the best way I know how to approach this topic, and so I think, I guess this is my podcast, so this is the way we're going to approach it together because this is the way I think we should. So here's what it says in Matthew 19, verses 3 through 10. And Pharisees came up to Jesus and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" Jesus answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce to her and send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." The disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." Now, a couple things I want to point out here. The first is realize that in this discussion that Jesus is being asked about, the Pharisees are asking him this, and they're asking it to test him. So automatically something is up. Something is up. They're not just saying, Jesus, we want to be godly husbands. We want to love our wives. What do you say about the way we do that? Nope, that's not the case at all. The Pharisees are trying to test Jesus by introducing to him what they perceive to be a green light from the Old Testament that gives them free ground to divorce their wife for any cause. In fact, that's the way they ask Jesus the question. And it would help you to know that in Jesus' day, through the years, but in Jesus' day, there was kind of a hot debate around this topic. Several rabbis had been consulted at various points and offered their teaching on what they thought Jesus meant. Jesus here does in Matthew 19 clarify this idea of except on the ground of sexual immorality, but there was some other teaching, which I'll get to in a second, in Deuteronomy 24, which introduced this idea that if somehow he no longer finds favor, his wife no longer finds favor in his eyes, or that the husband has found some indecency in her, he then writes her a certificate of divorce and he puts her out of his hands and sends her out of his house. So this debate became a real, they entered into a debate rather, and that was this matter of indecency and what does that mean? And Deuteronomy 24, let me just read Deuteronomy 24, then I can introduce this point. I think that might help. So Deuteronomy 24 verses 1-4 says this, and just hang on. This is like all one super long sentence, and it's kind of funny if you think about it, and sad and strange, but just track with me for a minute if you would. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house. And if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband, who sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. Now, as I said, that's kind of a strange thing, and it's all one super long sentence. But I want you to listen to what it's saying. This isn't saying something about telling you what to do. It's just saying if you're a husband and you find some indecency in your wife and you give her a certificate of divorce, which breaks this legal, covenant agreement between the two of you and puts it in her hand and sends her out, and she goes and marries somebody else, and he also finds something indecent in her and he gives her a certificate of divorce and sends her out, then that first husband who originally gave her the certificate can't come back in and be like, hey, you can be my wife now, because that's just first of all, it's treating women like property and like objects to be exchanged between men. And it's also pointing out this idea that just because the man finds an indecency in her, it's not giving him justification for divorcing her. Moses is not saying this is what you should do. He's simply saying if you do this, then you may not come back around full circle 2 weeks later when the second guy also finds an indecency in her and decide, okay, well, she maybe wasn't as bad as I thought, so I'm going to bring her back into my house. This is totally goofy and strange and weird, but it was just that this was the process that was taking place in ancient marriages, and the law steps in and says, this is a broken system. This is a messed up, dysfunctional type of operating between men and women. I'm going to put some kind of a break. I'm going to put the brakes on into this a little bit and say, this cannot just be some perpetual passing women around, finding some indecency in her, and then casting her out and then doing it over and over again between men. That is not at all what I have decided that you as my people are going to embody. That's an abomination before me. And so what happened was, in these debates, was this matter of indecency, which is more or less a technical and legal phrase. It's only used here in the entire Old Testament. And so the debate began. And they had two rabbis who engaged in this debate and spread their teaching around the community. The first was Rabbi Shammai, who said that something that is displeasing or something that is indecent, right, simply meant something in the terms of sexual immorality. So this is something that is done outside the marriage. So the wife, in some sense, has become unfaithful. She has slept with another man. She has committed adultery against her own husband. And so that is the thing that a man now can say, hey, if this has taken place, there's already a breaking of the marriage covenant. So I am going to send you away here. This has become now a grounds for divorce. There was another rabbi by the name of Hillel, and he decided that the word displeasing or the word indecency simply meant anything that didn't please the husband. Now, is it shocking that Hillel's view became the predominant view of the Pharisees in Jesus' day? Here is the question that the Pharisees, who once again are attempting to test Jesus, you need to understand, like I said before, this is not a question of the Pharisees or genuine followers of Jesus or genuine followers of God saying, how do I honor God in God's kingdom by the way I live out my life with my wife? That's not the question that's being asked. In fact, we're told in no uncertain terms in Matthew 19 that the Pharisees explicitly come to Jesus to test him. And I want to share with you in this context where there are two prevailing views of what it means to be displeasing or indecent to my husband. What does Jesus say? The Pharisees want Jesus to weigh in on this debate. They want him to weigh in on, can I divorce my wife for any cause? This is their question. Matthew 19:3 says, the Pharisees came up to Jesus and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? The Pharisees want to know, can we divorce our wives? Now, the debate begins in Deuteronomy 24, which again is the only time this word indecency is used anywhere in the Old Testament. It's this technical and legal term. And so the Pharisees have centered this entire debate around Deuteronomy 24. They've looked at this idea, again, this context that was broken and dysfunctional, where God says, I'm going to put the brakes on a little bit into this dysfunction, and I'm at least going to slow down this process to prevent these women from just being passed from man to man to man who didn't find her to be completely pleasing in his eyes. The Pharisees now want Jesus to weigh in, not only on this debate, but to give his explanation of what Deuteronomy 24 means. Now, here's what's really interesting. Jesus, again, two Pharisees who most likely know the scriptures and are clearly referring to Deuteronomy 25, says to them, have you not read? Now, this would be a really, an insulting question, because the Pharisees, of course, have read the scriptures. In fact, this entire debate centers around their intimate knowledge with this technical and legal term that's found tucked away in the middle of Deuteronomy. But Jesus says, have you not read? And he's not saying, have you not read Deuteronomy 24? Or have you not read Deuteronomy 5, which is the 10 Commandments or something like that? He says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Now, this is Jesus' initial answer, and he gives it in two parts. He says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? Here, Jesus is quoting from Genesis 1:26 and 27. And 28. It's this command, this idea that the Lord said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And he made male and female. Now, what's absolutely central about this is that Jesus is reminding the Pharisees of God's original intent in the way he created human beings. He created men and women, male and female, in his image after his likeness. It is not the case that men are created in the image of God and women are property or objects to be disposed of or to be used for the man's benefit. That is not the case. Male and female were to rule creation side by side over the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, and the beasts of the land. They were never instructed to rule over one another. The ruling over one another is something that enters into the creation after the fall and as a result of the fall. Not because that's what God wants, but because this is the direction the world takes. And so Jesus says, you realize that when you're quoting a law that was given in a broken, dysfunctional, fallen world, that is not God's standard for true righteousness. God's standard for true righteousness goes all the way back to the beginning, before the fall ever happened. And in the beginning, male and female are both made in the image of God, and male and female are both called to rule creation side by side. Jesus then jumps to the very next chapter. In speaking about marriage, when the woman is created and says, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The two shall become one. And the man is the one who leaves the security and the protection of his own family and joins himself to his wife so that she too shares protection and love and care from him, so that together they become one. So marriage is not a picture of two people where one is the primary, desirable one, the husband, and if he finds something indecent or something that he doesn't like about his wife, then he can just disregard her. Marriage is a covenant where the two equal and distinct male-female partners enter into a covenant where they become one. They are equal before God, equal before each other, are both made in God's image, and rule the creation together as a unit. And so Jesus says, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So here in the Pharisees' question, they're attempting to ask Jesus, what can we do to separate? What does it require? What is the grounds for being able to separate? And their question is not, Jesus, what could we do to maintain oneness? They're saying, Jesus, what does the law say that allows us to become separate? And I want you to notice the direction of their question. The direction of their question is, how do we separate this thing that we've now put together, instead of saying, how do we unify this thing that might constantly be trying to become separate? Because in a fallen world, let's just be honest, two people coming together who both are sinful, who both have their own ideas of what healthy life and flourishing would look like, it's tricky at times, can we be honest, to try to think about how to maintain unity when disunity is so much more natural. Well, the Pharisees, of course, jump all over this, and they don't like this because this isn't where their debate starts. They don't even bring Genesis 1 and 2 into their debate. They go right back to Deuteronomy 24. Verse 7 of Matthew 19 says, they said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? Now, this is fascinating to me. Fascinating, but it's also sad. I want to reread Deuteronomy 24. I just want you to listen to what it actually says, and I want you to remember that the Pharisees believe that Deuteronomy 24 commands men to give her a certificate of divorce and to send her away. Listen to Deuteronomy 24 again. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house. And if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. Notice there's only one command in this entire sentence, and that is the former husband can't take this woman to be his wife again after she's been defiled. That's the command. It's there to protect women from just being shuffled around from man to man to man to man. Nowhere in this passage is Moses commanding anything about a certificate. He's simply suggesting if you take a woman to be your wife and she finds no favor in your eyes because of some decency, and you write her a certificate of divorce and put it in her hand, and she goes out and her other husband does the same thing, then you can't remarry her. He's never said this is a command. And so Jesus responds in verse 8 of Matthew 19. Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so." Now, Jesus is going back again to Genesis 1 and 2. Notice he says, but from the beginning, it was not so. But there's a special little way to look at these words that I want to focus in on. The Pharisees say to Jesus, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" And Jesus says, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives." So we're in a little bit of a conundrum here. Jesus is now saying, Moses allowed you to do this because your hearts were hard. And when your hearts are hard and you're treating women with an incredible level of mistreatment and not caring for her and not looking after her, we find ourselves in a really strange situation. Moses is now allowing you because of your hardness of heart. And the hardness of heart is looking at marriage as a place that is meant only to serve you. Now, I know that marriages can be hard. And I know that some of you listening to this podcast are in challenging and difficult and struggling marriages. And I understand that listening to what Jesus is saying here might come across as a discouragement to you, or it might come across as an encouragement. And what I mean is looking at Jesus reminding us of the way God originally intended the world to be is not eliminating the idea that there are many people in marriages today who do not have Jesus's view of the purpose of marriage, or who were not instructed that women are the same as men, and that both are made in the image of God, and that both are called to rule the creation on God's behalf side by side, not one over the other. And some women that I know have spent years of their life in troubled marriages because their husbands don't adhere to the teaching that Jesus gives about equality between the sexes from Genesis 1 and 2. Instead, they subscribe to this Deuteronomy 24 mentality that if a wife doesn't in every way, shape, or form please her husband exactly how the husband thinks she should, then the husband has some grounds to become a jerk, or to become distant, or to start pulling away in some way. And this is where I want to read the second Old Testament passage that shows up that talks about divorce. And here is what it says, strangely enough, in the context of polygamy. So I don't think we want to take this law and make it mean that polygamy is what God intended. Rather, in a world that is filled with polygamy, God is giving some guidance in how to bring a bit more health and human flourishing to that culture. So here's what he says. If a man takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. If he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. Now, in the context, what is basically being said is if a man takes another wife, he isn't to neglect his first wife by diminishing her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And marital rights is sexual intimacy, sexual closeness and affection. He is not to withhold those things from his first wife. And if he does, this wife may go out for nothing. She isn't required to pay back her bride price. She's not required to do some type of financial obligations to the husband in order to break away from the marriage, but rather she's free to leave that marriage free of charge because the husband has failed to live out these obligations before her. Now, this is interesting because when Jesus is correcting the Pharisees, they're interested in a debate that centers around Deuteronomy 24. And so Jesus addresses Deuteronomy 24. He talks to them about this idea of divorce. And then he also says in verse 9 of Matthew 19, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So the Pharisees were trying to get Jesus to buy into the fact that, hey, if I give my wife a certificate of divorce and send her away, then I'm not, I've not done anything wrong. I haven't committed adultery. They're basically saying, because I'm following the law, which again, they believed was a command given by Moses, because I've done this thing where Moses has commanded me to send my wife out with a certificate of divorce, then I can in no way, shape, or form be accused of adultery. And what Jesus is saying is, and interestingly enough, when he says, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, Jesus is saying, even though you've given her a certificate of divorce, in God's eyes, you're still one. You're still a unit. And if you back out on her, not because of something she's done, but because of something you've decided, oh, it's indecent, well, Jesus weighs in on this debate, and he kind of lands on the Shammai view, that the indecency or the something that shouldn't be there is basically the sexual immorality, something that the woman has done outside the marriage. And basically what Jesus is saying is, if a woman has stepped outside of the marriage by committing adultery, then she's already broken the marriage vow. And in that sense, it is permissible for the husband to go ahead and dissolve the marriage. But that wasn't the point of debate of topic in Jesus's day. In Jesus's day, it was pretty well accepted that if the wife did anything that was displeasing to her husband, sadly, there are accounts of a woman burning the dinner for her husband, and that is the thing that is displeasing in his eyes in the first century, and therefore that was grounds for divorce. And I sadly have known Christian men in my own lifetime who the way they expect their wives to clean up the house or clean up after them or have dinner ready the moment they walk home from work, and the expectations that men have that their every need will be fulfilled in their marriage by their wife becomes a very one-sided and very lopsided relationship where it appears, at least looking in from the outside, that this man has forgotten that this wife of his is also made in the image of God and is called to rule over creation on God's behalf right alongside the man, that she doesn't exist merely to serve his every whim and his every supposed need. Rather, marriage is supposed to become a oneness where there truly is shared unity in a relationship. That's God's intent. That's Jesus's intent for his kingdom. And so immediately after talking about anger and lust in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addresses adultery. He addresses divorce. He's addressed adultery in the heart, right? And now you think about this, he's addressing divorce in the heart. And where does he go with it? Well, in Matthew 19, which again is just an expansion of what Jesus says in Matthew 5, he repeats himself in Matthew 5, everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So look at what Jesus is doing. Jesus is now saying in the kingdom, you're not just an adulterer, but you're making someone else an adulterer by your supposed actions of doing what the law says to do. So Jesus is so into the heart of the matter here. He is so detailed in the way that he is looking at these topics that he's saying, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. And as if you do that, you are now a law-abiding Israelite, you are embodying true righteousness, okay? But that's not the case, because you could do all of that and still have a hardened heart. This is what Jesus is pointing out. And I would submit to you that there are lots of people in our world. The heart is a very tricky thing. But there are lots of people in our world who will look high and they will look low for justifications for why they should be allowed to get out of a difficult situation. And here's what's so hard about this topic is that I know of a lot of people who have been divorced. I know of a lot of people who are in marriages that are hard and who want to be faithful to God. They want to honor God. And if they've been divorced before, they might carry around shame and guilt that they have done the wrong thing and that they never should have gotten divorced. Or if there's somebody who thinks about getting a divorce, they feel guilty and ashamed that they are imagining a world where their life could flourish more fruitfully than it currently is. Some people are in abusive relationships, physically, emotionally, spiritually, socially. Some spouses have prevented their other spouse from maintaining close relationships outside of their marriage relationship, or have been in places where pornography is now a part of the marriage and help has been sought. Counseling has been offered as a possibility. Nothing is changing. I want to let you know that the moment Jesus introduces why Moses allowed the certificate of divorce into this context was because of people's hardness of heart. Now, here is what is very hard about kingdom righteousness. In kingdom righteousness, the hardness of heart is what God knows and what the people involved know, but very rarely can another person perfectly detect. So when I get into this topic with people, I want to talk to them personally. I want to get into their stories personally, because for me to attempt to assess, is the hardness of heart what is going on right here? Or is this a willful decision or desire to get out of the marriage? Or has everything truly been tried? And there's just a stubborn refusal on the part of one spouse to truly work on things to make this life better for the spouse and for the family. I know in our fallen, broken world, sometimes relationships come to a screeching halt because one party simply is unwilling to do the personal self-examination required to cause life and flourishing to happen in that oneness, unity of marriage. But in Exodus 21, we're told that if a man takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish the first wife's food, clothing, or marital rights. And so, another way to think about this would basically be like desertion, abandonment, neglect, abuse, whatever it happens to be, neglect, right? Any of these things that are happening in a marriage, if the husband does these kinds of things, this could be grounds, and there are some who hold to this particular teaching, that this would be grounds for a separation. Paul seems to allude to something similar to this in 1 Corinthians 7. He says this doesn't come from the Lord, so Jesus never spoke to this, but Paul does say, if an unbelieving spouse deserts you, you are free to remarry. That actually sounds quite a bit like Exodus 21. I don't know that for a fact, and some people will say, well, my spouse is a Christian. Well, let me say this. Jesus will say later on in the sermon, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And Jesus will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. The very Sermon on the Mount that is addressing lust, anger, adultery, divorce, on and on and on, is talking to those who would be followers of Jesus, who would become citizens of his kingdom. And Jesus says, in the end, Many will say to him, did we not do these great spiritual accomplishments? And Jesus will say to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who live as though I never gave you a law to follow. That's what lawlessness actually means. And we'll get to that section in Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 and following. But what that says to me is that when Paul says, if an unbelieving spouse no longer wants to be in this marriage, if an unbelieving spouse has disregarded you, has neglected you, has abused you, has mistreated you, even if they claim, as Jesus says, many will claim in the end, I'm a Christian, I follow God. What are you talking about? Like, you can't divorce me. I think through prayer and through counsel and through help, we very well may be able to come to the conclusion that Jesus invites us to come to by judging a tree by its fruit, that regardless of what that spouse is saying, what they are doing is communicating loudly and clearly that they are not Christians. So you go right back to 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul then gives people, if an unbelieving spouse wants to get out of this marriage and has broken his vows, then you are free. You are not bound by him. You are not obligated to remain in close relationship to him. And yet I have to throw in an additional caution. And that is that the human heart, once again, can come up with all sorts of justifications to imagine the world in which we want to live and be free to do as we choose. And so I'm not giving some green light to any struggling marriage to decide that divorce is the perfect option. But what I am saying is that if there is a hardened heart, there is a consumer heart, there is a, I want to get divorced for any and every reason, which is the way the Pharisees began their debate and their test of Jesus. I don't want us to fall into that trap either. And so I know I've been in churches long enough to know, well, yeah, some people take a really hard line, like there's absolutely no divorce, there's no remarriage, just take that stance, which some do. And so the only grounds for divorce is sexual immorality. So if a husband is mistreating you and he is disrespectful to you and he won't have sex with you, but he's not having sex with somebody else, well, then that means that you can't get divorced because he's not being unfaithful. We have to look at this as kingdom citizens. We have to look at marriages and the vows and the promises that were made one to another. We have to look at the unity that's in the marriage. We have to understand the oneness that's supposed to be present and the righteousness that flourishes. And we also have to look at the fact that when hard and fast lines are drawn in the sand about these topics, we do want to evaluate which of the genders in those relationships is suffering in an unbalanced kind of a way. And I don't think it is too much of a stretch. I don't think it's a stretch at all to suggest very strongly that it is oftentimes the women who suffer when these hard lines are drawn in the sand. And that is not the way it's supposed to be. In fact, in the teaching on lust and now on the teaching on divorce, Jesus is addressing the men because it's the men who sit around and debate these topics, taking allowances that Moses gives in the law and making them commands and justifying their own behaviors by, I did the right thing. I wrote her a certificate of divorce. What's the big deal? Instead of saying, what could you have done from the beginning to love your wife as you love yourself? That's what we're looking for. That's what Jesus is calling us to. And I think it's incredibly, incredibly, incredibly important. And so I think that's Jesus' teaching. Does Jesus give a hard and fast line? I don't really think so. I do think he acknowledges that if there is sexual immorality, that there is grounds for divorce. But I also recognize that that is challenging, and people have spent time and energy and money and resources to discover what is exactly sexual immorality. Is that just a man looking at porn? Is that sexual immorality? Right? Does he have to physically have sex with somebody who isn't his wife? What if this man just has a major lust problem? You know, Jesus has addressed lust. So do we decide that lust is his issue? And here's why I push back the way I did in that episode 2 weeks ago, is that when Jesus gives his guidance for what to do, right? I have this lust problem, so I'm going to cut off my hand or I'm going to tear out my right eye. Notice that Jesus isn't saying to lop off the people in your life who are causing that, because Jesus says the issue is in the heart. It's always in the heart. And the way that we are faced with this reality of if divorce is the direction we want to go, humility calls us to recognize, okay, I just don't have it in me. I just don't have what it takes to make this work. I don't think that I can function in a relationship that is abusive. Those are real questions that need a real listening ear and that need to be taken really seriously for people in marriages who feel trapped, who feel stuck, who feel like there is no way out. What they should not be receiving is commands from the Bible which forbid them from having a life where they can flourish as human beings. Will there be more pain brought into the relationship if divorce happens? Possibly. Will additional pain happen in their lives if they remain in the marriage? Most likely. What is the solution? That is something that is a very big question. And I think in a fallen, broken world, the solution is that both husbands and wives would look inward, would evaluate their own hearts, their own motives, would decide on the kind of boundaries that they can and cannot live with in a marriage, share those openly and honestly with their spouse, and decide together, are we in this together for the honor of Jesus and the flourishing of each of our lives and the flourishing of our family, or are we not? And this, I think, is a healthier way to approach this topic. Not because I think divorce is a good idea, but because I've seen lives completely ruined and destroyed, all in the name of we're going to honor God by not getting divorced. And avoiding divorce becomes the goal instead of life and human flourishing within marriage. We're right back to the Pharisees again, if that's the questions we're asking. When am I not doing what's wrong? Well, I'm not doing what's wrong by not getting a divorce. No. Are you loving your wife as you love yourself? Are you caring for her? Are you meeting her needs? Are you asking her about her day? Are you taking the time to listen to her? Are you telling jokes to your coworkers about your wife and what she said to you the other night because you want to sound like a tough guy in the presence of people who are going to get a good laugh out of it? How do you think about your spouse? How do you treat her? How do you honor her? How do you protect her? How do you give her the freedom to pursue her own dreams and goals? What do you do to cause the life and flourishing of another human being? Those are the questions you want to ask. And for those spouses who don't have a spouse who does that, you'll want to ask some difficult questions too. Are you in this? Are we a unit or aren't we? Where are we trying to go with this? Are we maintaining a marriage just to give off the appearance that we are godly people, even though both of us know that within this marriage, godliness is the furthest thing from reality? These are tough questions without super simple answers. But what Jesus is calling us to is creating lives within our own hearts that cause other people's lives to flourish. Not, as he says in Matthew 5, that if you divorce your wife, you're causing her now to commit adultery. And any person that she goes off and marries is also committing adultery. Look at what Jesus has done to the original Deuteronomy 24 allowance. In Deuteronomy 24, you could just pass a woman along, and as long as that man wrote a certificate of divorce, he was completely innocent of any wrongdoing. And Jesus is saying, in the kingdom, real righteousness always relates to how the lives around you flourish, not just your own life. Because Jesus, in the embodiment of God himself, defined righteousness by what he was willing to do for the world, not just what he was willing to do between him and God. Because if it was just between Jesus and the Father, why mess with the incarnation, right? Why mess with it at all? But it's not about that. Real righteousness is always doing right for the benefit and blessing of others. And so in Matthew 5, Jesus says, if you walk out and you cause disruption already to happen to these other people, you're not caring for them. But then don't make the mistake of suggesting that if within the marriage already there's been a break in the relationship and there's dysfunction and things are not flourishing and the lives that are being ruined are those involved in the marriage itself, then what are we holding on to? The idea that we don't get divorced and therefore honor marriage somehow? The way Jesus says you honor marriage, and therefore the way you honor God who created marriage, is by treating your spouse with love and kindness and compassion and understanding and sympathy and care and consideration and grace and love. When those things are present, you don't want to separate. But when those things aren't present, the heart longs to be known in those ways and appreciated for who you actually are. And that's what marriage should be. So I know that potentially was a heavy episode, and I apologize for that, and yet I also don't apologize. I am really sorry for those of you who listen into the podcast and who have very real challenges and struggles. And I am sorry for those of you who have been told at various points in your life about what God's clear teaching is on this topic, and why if you dare even think about a divorce, that somehow you are out of step with Him. I'm really thankful for those of you who are as committed to God as you actually are, and have shared many times the ways that you've pushed through and have discovered new things about God and new things about yourself in the process. And I'm thankful to many of you as well who listen to this podcast and whose marriages are exciting and full of life. And you and your spouse truly love each other at an incredibly deep level and are experiencing deeper and deeper levels of love the longer you're together. I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful that you're in my life and can teach me things about what it means to love my wife as I love myself. So I am grateful for you listeners. I'm thankful that you're continuing to tune in. And if you have questions or comments or thoughts, please feel free to email me, unbindingthebible@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to know how I can pray for you. And I hope that you all have a fantastic week. And I will talk to you next time.
You've been listening to Unbinding the Bible. If you find these episodes valuable and you haven't already done so, please leave a rating or review, or both, on whatever podcast app you choose to listen to these episodes. And then go and share one or more of your favorite episodes with a friend. You can also reach out to Joshua with any comments or questions to unbindingthebible@gmail.com. Thanks for listening and have a great week.